my understanding of the Black Madonna is not just that she is that the darkness is the color of her skin, but the hour in which she comes.
Oh,
She
I
is the
see.
hour of God, that she comes in the dark. She's not just dark skinned, but she represents that
Mhm.
that portal. She is like the dark skinned lover, beloved in the Song of Songs. For lo, I am black and I am beautiful, right? She's dark skinned.
Right.
And the Black Madonnas of Europe were very closely connected with the beloved from the Song of Songs. The people during the Middle Ages, like Bernard of Clairvaux, drew a direct connection between the Black Madonnas that they prayed to and the Shulamite from the Song of Songs.
Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science, consciousness studies, spirituality, and philosophy. And in addition to our online presentations with guest speakers, we offer classes and study groups also online. We have over 100 video recordings on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. And as a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep Caritas going. So if you'd like to support our program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website. And now let me introduce tonight's speaker. Clark Strand is an American author and lecturer on spirituality and religion. A former Zen Buddhist monk, he was the first senior editor of Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. Am I saying that right, or is it Tricycle? I always wondered.
Tricycle, yeah.
It is Tricycle, just like okay. He left that position in 1996 and moved to Woodstock, New York to write and teach full-time. He's also a poet and has published 2 books of his poetry. And this book, where did I put it? Here it is. This book is the one, he has written several books. And this is the one that we're going to be talking about tonight. Waking Up to the Dark, the Black Madonna's Gospel for an Age of Extinction and Collapse. Fascinating topic, and it's a fascinating book. I really enjoyed it and highly recommend it. Interesting subject that I had never really thought that much about. So welcome, Clark. Happy to have you here.
Thanks so much, Gloria. I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight.
Me too. Let's begin with, let's see, your love affair with the dark began as a child. You make a good point in your book when you say that small children are not so much afraid of the dark, but of being alone. Because when they're left alone in the dark, that's what I would say predicates the fear.
Yeah.
And I had never thought of that before, but it makes a lot of sense. So I guess we learn to associate the dark with being alone. And then we think we're afraid of the dark, right?
I think, people in developed nations, where children are more likely to be put in a room of their own to sleep at night, may associate the darkness with being alone. I don't think that children naturally associate the darkness with being alone. In fact, in cultures around the world, even today, children sleep with their parents, and certainly that was the norm until very, very recently. When people were taught that, largely as a result of early, very flawed psychological theories, they shouldn't do that. that they shouldn't sleep together with their children at night. And so I think that most children, especially in pre-modern societies, experienced the darkness as a time of closeness, and communion, and actual, even the physical presence of their parents, right, or their siblings, that they would be all together. When Perdita and I moved from New York City to Woodstock, New York, when our second child was born, we just got a bunch of futons and just made, one whole room, the room that's now our bedroom, into the sleeping room, right? And
Mm-hmm.
everybody had plenty of room. There were all the animals. There was me, Perdita, both kids. And
Mm-hmm.
at a certain point, the kids got old enough to want their own bed, their own room. And we had the space for that.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a lot of going back and forth for a year, probably. They start in their
Uh-huh.
room, come back to us, and they go back, and then eventually they sort of liked having their own space. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense.
It's a
Um,
wonderful experience.
yeah. So was that your experience? Because unlike most children in our culture, you loved the dark as a child. So how did you escape this association?
Well, I don't know. That's a mystery to me. I
Uh-huh.
couldn't tell you. I certainly, I did not. There was no such thing as a family bed in the culture I was brought up in the South. I had I'm sure I had my own room to sleep in, even as an infant, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a very young boy certainly having my own room that I slept in.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I I don't remember exactly when I began to wake in the dark and realize that I was awake and lying awake in the middle of the night. But I would guess it was probably when I was around 8 years old. We were
Mm-hmm.
living in Anniston, Alabama, sort of the northern part of the state, and the sort of lower foothills of the Smokies. And we lived near a golf course, so there's a lot of off to one side of us. There's quite a lot of velvety, pitch black darkness, right? And then in general, the world was not as hyper lit as it is today, especially
Mm-hmm.
in a small city like Anniston, and sort of being, in the more residential area of it. And so there wasn't a lot of ambient light. I'm sure my parents probably put me to bed not that long after dark, right? So there was a lot of real estate there, in
Mm-hmm.
the nighttime, right? There was a lot of time. So at a certain point, I would begin waking up in the middle of the night, and I would just be awake for a while, and then I would go back to sleep. It took me decades to realize that that was natural. I didn't know that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
At a certain point, I realized that I could get up because everybody was asleep. My parents had already long since become acculturated to the cultural norm of compressing our sleep nights, like our work days, into convenient 8-hour blocks, right? This happened about the time of the Industrial Revolution, and it becomes cemented, across the industrialized developed world by the 20th century. My parents have long since been acculturated to that, so they slept soundly through the night for the most part. But I was awake, so I'd get up and I'd start to walk around the house. And at a certain point, I was young, a boy, I was bored, and I started to realize that I could go out on the back porch. So I would go out on the back porch. After that, I got a little bit bored with that after a while. I thought, well, I could just stroll out into the yard. Eventually, I got to the golf course. Right. So I was within probably a few months. I don't really know how long it took. My memory of that time is pretty sketchy, but I realized at a certain point that, I was getting up most nights, and if the weather was okay, I would go out on the golf course and walk around under the stars. And I never saw anybody else. People say, well, weren't you afraid? I mean, but nowadays would be afraid a child would be, abducted or molested or something like that. But there was no one else awake. Never saw any cars, never saw anyone. Just me and the lost golf balls out there, occasionally illuminated by the moon. I found golf balls. Strangely
Mm-hmm.
enough, a golf ball a lost golf ball is more visible by moonlight than it is by daylight. So I used to
Yeah, that makes
pocket
sense.
them and bring them back in my pockets sometimes. Only once was I apprehended by my mother, and I pretended to be sleepwalking. And I think it was easier. I can't imagine how she could have bought the idea that I was sleepwalking because I had shoes on. But I think it was easier to assume that I was, that I was not feigning this because the alternative was probably incomprehensible to her. What possible non antisocial behavior could my young son be engaging in alone in the dark in the middle of the night, right? So it was easier just to say, okay, you're sleepwalking and put me to bed and go back to bed. By the time I got into high school, it had become a real routine for me and something I was very comfortable with. And when I got to college, uh, I went to a college on the top of the Cumberland Plateau in Middle Tennessee. My sister is on this call tonight, who's visiting us in Woodstock. She went to the same college. And sometimes I think I chose it because it was a great place to walk and because it was so dark at night.
Where was it?
It's on the top of it's at the bottom of the Cumberland Plateau in Middle Tennessee, about
Oh,
40, 50 miles above Chattanooga. And
okay.
so it's in the mountains, very,
Hmm.
very dark. The at that time it was the largest campus in the world, land area, like 10,000 acres. And there are only 1,000 students. So you do the math. Uh,
Wow.
a lot of woods and meadows and forests to wander around in. I spent a lot of time walking in the middle of the night in college. And
Mm.
it continued, and during
Mhm.
my as a Zen Buddhist monk, and and since then, since we moved to Woodstock in 1996, this is sort of a lifelong habit, as it were.
Right. Amazing. So in ancient times, before artificial light kept us up after dark, people had a different pattern of sleep. And so, can you tell us about that sleep study that Dr. Thomas Ware of the NIH conducted?
Yeah,
And how
this
long
was
ago
in the
was it? When was it again?
it was in the 1990s. I can't remember the exact date.
Okay.
I think it was around 1992 or three.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, I have the.
Thomas Ware he's a psychobiologist by profession. He was the man who discovered basically circadian rhythms and seasonal affective disorder he did discover. I'm not sure if he was the person who first studied circadian rhythms, but he's one of the earliest researchers in this area. And Thomas Ware was researching with the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and he realized that he had a question as an expert on sleep studies. His question was, did human beings always sleep the way they do now, or was there a primordial pattern or style of sleep? Did ancient people sleep better? Did they sleep more? Did they sleep differently? He reasoned correctly, it turned out, that it was an easy enough thing to determine because human biology, and specifically the human genome, changes very slowly. And so chances are, whatever that ancient pattern of sleep was probably still encoded in our genes. And so it would only be necessary to take human beings off all forms of artificial illumination for a period of time to see how they slept. And that would replicate roughly, the ancient pattern of sleep. So Ware took, I think, I can't remember the exact number. I think it was maybe 18 or 19 people off the streets, ordinary people off the streets of Bethesda, Maryland, and he took them off all forms of artificial illumination, even the luminescent dial of a clock, right, of an analog clock, for a month. And for the first 3 weeks, basically, the results followed about what he suspected, which was that people slept on average an hour and a half longer than they had previously. Ware called this repaying the national sleep debt because Americans get too little sleep.
Mm.
So he felt this was very natural. He expected this to happen, and in fact, it did happen. What he did not expect was that not a few, but 100% of the people in his study. And if you know anything at all about, you know, medical studies, sleep studies, any kind of scientific study, you get 100% results of anything is extremely rare.
Mm-hmm.
To have absolute confirmation of something in a scientific study is a very unusual phenomenon, right? Usually the studies are somewhat ambiguous and require a great deal of statistical analysis in order to even figure out what the results truly are. Well, the results of this were ironclad because what happened was the subjects in the study would lie in bed for anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours, just relaxing, and then after dusk, and then they would all fall asleep. They would sleep for 4 hours, deep sleep, and then they would wake. They would wake for 2 hours in the middle of the night, and then they would go back to sleep for 4 more hours of deep sleep, and then wake in the morning. Every subject in the study reverted to this pattern, which where it concluded was the primordial pattern of sleep. Now, he
And
needn't
each of
have,
them, Clark, each of them was in their own space
yeah,
on
they
a
had, yes, they
campus.
had their own. I can't remember. At one point, I got curious enough to look into the details of the study. And yes, they had their own. No, it wasn't like
It
communal living
wasn't,
like that.
yeah, okay.
They had their own special dark space that they slept in.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, so so yeah, so every, where determined that this was the primordial pattern of sleep. Now he needn't have gone to such great lengths to find this out, because if you look in the literature, like diaries, sleep records, records kept by convents and monasteries and ashrams, historical records going back all the way to Homer and beyond, you find that this was a very well known phenomenon. It was called by ancient people like Homer the first and second sleep of the night. And Ware got very curious, and he teamed up with a historian of technology, a couple of different historians of technology, and determined that there was, in fact, a vast amount of literature validating the fact that until the Industrial Revolution and the rise of incandescent lighting, like bright lighting, lighting that could extend the range of work hours and recreational hours well past dusk, this was the pattern of sleep that people followed. What really surprised him, however, was the self-report that he got from people. He was curious enough to ask people, well, how does that feel? They said two things. The first thing they said was that they felt phenomenal spiritual and physical peace and quiet during these 2 hours in the middle of the night, like just phenomenal levels of quietness and peace and relaxation. That was some of the deepest relaxation they reported ever having felt in their lives, right? Like being, having a 90-minute massage and the way you feel at the end of it. They were saying they felt this way every night. The second thing was that they said, and they all reported the same thing, that they felt more awake during the daytime than they had ever felt before. In fact, a few of the participants said they felt like they had never really been awake before in their entire lives. Suddenly, they felt like they were awake. So, Ware decided, being a scientist, right? I mean, if you read the study and read some of the interviews with Ware later on, he sounds more like a Jungian analyst, because this study radicalized him, right? It made him realize that there was something going on in the middle of the night that just defied modern understanding and transcended our memory as a species. Our memory, we basically suppressed our memory of this state of mind that used to be a natural birthright. But at the time, he was still very much in scientific mode, still very much in the throes of the study and trying to make sense of it and to write it up. That he got curious, so he followed through. he sampled their bloodstream, basically the chemicals, biochemicals that were active during this period of time. And he discovered that the hormone prolactin, which is the hormone that keeps birds quiet and at rest when they're roosting on their eggs and keeps mothers calm while they're nursing their infants. It's also the chemical that reaches elevated levels when we're asleep, keeps our body still while we're sleeping so that we don't act out our dreams, so we don't hurt ourselves, so that we can rest and our bodies can be very calm. What he discovered was that although an average person who wakes up in the middle of the night and is anxious and feels like they have insomnia and worried about getting back to sleep, when they wake up, because they're trying to compress their sleep nights into 8-hour blocks, when they wake up, their prolactin levels immediately fall. But when you're given enough darkness on either side to work with, and you retire with at dusk and rise at dawn, and you're sleeping with the rhythm of the seasons, when you do that, when you wake up for these 2 hours in the middle of the night, your prolactin levels remain at sleep levels.
Mhm.
So you're awake, but your body is as relaxed as it would be if you were asleep.
That's
Now,
fascinating.
if you ever read the Song of Songs, which is this beautiful love poem, erotic love poem that somehow found
Mhm.
its way into the Judeo-Christian Bible, right?
Right.
Uh, it's this amazing poem, and in this poem, the lover or the beloved says to her lover, she says, "I sleep, but my heart is awake.
Mhm.
Sleep, but my heart is awake." And people will interpret this spiritually, but I realized, when I was doing my research for Waking Up to the Dark, that the author of that poem, which was probably one of the oldest books of the Bible, it's probably written composed 3,000 years ago, maybe 4,000 years ago in Egypt originally.
Mhm.
And it was composed by somebody for whom this state of mind was still easily accessible. They're describing an actual state of mind, body and mind. So he discovered that they were, in fact, what they were reporting had a biochemical explanation. Then he wanted to know, well, they say they feel more awake, but maybe that just means they're rested. Are they really more awake? So he contacted a friend of his, who another person at NIH, who was an expert on wakefulness, and he had developed a test to determine how awake a person was. So where uh, you know had his subjects take this test, and it turned out that they were more awake than the average person.
How
Not
did they
only that,
determine that? How did they measure that?
it's called I can't remember the first word. I think it's called, I may be remembering this wrong. I think it's called a variable sleep latency test. And it
Mhm.
basically measures wakefulness by how long it takes you to fall asleep in a very relaxed state, right? So I'm not sure how they figured that out, but there was a way they figured out how to measure it. So Ware determined that his subjects were more awake than fighter pilots when they're flying a fighter plane. Let's let that sink in for a moment. These are ordinary people who, after 1 month, had reverted to an ancient pattern of sleep that allowed them to feel basically a state to access a state of mind that today you would really only be able to replicate among like Tibetan lamas or Carthusian monks, right? I mean, people who live a very strict life of meditative practice, right, in a really controlled environment. His subjects were experiencing that with no training whatsoever after after 1 month or after 3 weeks on without any artificial lighting.
It's
So it's a
amazing.
pretty extraordinary set of results. I read this in the 90s, right about the time that our daughter Sophie was born. And a light, excuse this is not exactly a pun. This is ironic, but a light kind of went off in my head, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've been experiencing this all my life.
Uh,
Now I begin to understand what's really going on.
hmm,
Yeah.
fascinating. So it's the difference, as you say in the book, between what we call what anyway, Westerners who wake up in the middle of the night, what we call the hour of the wolf, the difference between that and the hour of God.
Yeah. Yeah. The hour of God was a term I had thought of some years earlier to describe this, because what I discovered was that in the literature of every religious tradition I studied,
Mhm.
from Islam to Judaism to Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, there was a tradition of waking up in the middle of the night during the same 2 hour span to pray or meditate or chant.
Yeah.
And it was universal. It, for the most part, they didn't know about one another. Like I got special permission to correspond with the novice master at the most strictly enclosed Catholic monastery in the United States, Mount Equinox Monastery, Carthusian Monastery, and Brother Mary Kim. And he had no idea that the Carthusian practice, which I think is the only Catholic order left today that still observes the hour of God in the middle of the night. They still wake for matins and
Mhm.
chant the Psalms in the middle of the night. The others of all the Catholic churches let all that tradition go.
Really? I thought they
Yeah,
still did that.
no, it's virtually the hour of God is virtually extinct in the Catholic Church
Uh,
as a spiritual practice.
uh,
They let it go. They didn't understand
it
what.
might get too mystical.
No, it was just modern. They were just modernizing,
Mhm.
getting, towing the line of modern industrial capitalism. So, the church, whatever the church actually says, the church
Mhm.
takes its primary bearing off of money and commerce. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, so they changed it, but the Carthusians resisted. So I wrote Brother Mary Kim, and he told me, I just told him what I was looking for. I wanted to know what the Carthusians said about this experience of waking in the middle of the night. He told me about a film that had been made at the Charter House about the called Into the Great Silence, or Into Great
Oh,
Silence, I think it's
yes.
called.
Yes.
Beautiful
Yes.
film.
Yeah.
Um, Made at the Charter House of the Grand Chartreuse in France.
Mhm.
And he told me about that, and basically made a connection to a man who had been a novice master there, who I later talked to as well.
Mhm.
But Brother Mary Kim had no idea that it was anything other than a Carthusian practice. He thought the Carthusians invented it.
Oh,
And
that's
I said,
interesting.
well, no.
Mhm.
The Jews thought I talked to rabbis, the rabbis thought they invented it 2,500 years ago. And they
Mm.
were surprised to learn they hadn't invented it. And the Hindus I talked to, the various gurus I interviewed and the imams, everybody thought they invented it, right? They were
Mhm.
all surprised to learn that it had its roots in among our remotest ancestors who also slept like this and had these experiences. A lot of the cave art was probably conceived of during this visionary state in the middle of the night.
What was conceived?
A lot of the Paleolithic cave art, the
Oh,
animal
cave
painting.
art. Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah.
yeah. In
Well,
fact, one way of understanding those cave paintings is that they are portraits not just of the animals, but portraits of the state of mind that they accessed during the middle of the night, the visionary state of union with the natural world and with their animal kin.
Mhm. In your book, you mentioned that the Upanishads um, describe four states of consciousness: the
Yeah,
waking state, the dream state, dreamless sleep, and the fourth one it calls Turiya or something like that.
right.
So that fourth state is how it
That's it.
relates to spiritual awakening.
Yeah, it said they said there was a state called the fourth, which was which was indefinable, right?
Mhm.
Because it included aspects of all the other three states of consciousness, but existed beyond them. Yeah,
Right.
and The Mandukya Upanishad, which is among the oldest of the Upanishads and certainly the shortest and most mysterious of them, uh, you know, is devoted specifically to this fourth state of consciousness. Yeah, yeah.
You also write, because we no longer honor the darkness, we have lost touch with the journey of the soul. So, what would you say is that journey? Is it not a journey that begins in the dark and moves toward light?
Hmm.
Would you say
Well,
like
that
a
would be like,
lotus?
yeah. I
Like
mean,
a
I know that
lotus?
that's a very popular trope, that has its origins. I think in the religions of the axial age, like you find the same trope in
Mhm.
Buddhism, you find it in Hinduism, you find it in ancient Greek religion and Greek thought. This
Mhm.
idea of going from darkness to light, right?
Well, when you go into deep meditation, you do see light.
Yeah, you may see light. I mean, you don't necessarily always, but you could. There are different types of meditation, and some of them are specifically cultivated or specifically designed to cultivate the experience of what many traditions call the uncreated light or the light of consciousness, the luminous ground of being. It's sometimes called, right?
Right. And mystics also, talk about, and people with near death experiences, you
Talk
know,
about going
uh,
into the light.
and
Yeah.
going into the light. And the way I think of it is that you have to start in the dark. That's why that metaphor of the lotus is always pleased me. I've always thought that was a very apt metaphor, because if
Right,
we don't accept the dark, then I don't know that we can find the light.
right.
But just like a seed needs the dark to start to grow, to start to,
Yeah.
but once
Well,
it
both
gets
are
through
necessary.
the ground,
I think we tend to privilege light. In I mean, really, it's universal. The
yeah.
privileging of light over darkness is pretty much universal throughout
It
the world.
reminds
Yeah.
me of, we're reading a book in one of our study groups right now. It's Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary. And it's about the left and right brain, and
Yeah.
how we have privileged, as you say, the left brain to the at the expense of the right brain, and at the expense of really our civilization, our culture, our all the meta crises that we're facing right now. Uh, it to me, I sense a connection
Ah,
between the two. Emphasizing the left brain and emphasizing the light in
right.
over darkness. I think they're both important. And but we're just totally out of balance with it.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that there has been a general trend uh, uh, since the axial age, since the age when the great philosophies and religions were coming into being. There has been a movement towards anthropocentrism.
Yes.
All
Yes.
religions,
Yes.
with the exception of a few outliers, among the
Indigenous culture.
indigenous peoples and indigenous cultures, have placed a premium on human destiny, human thought, human experience. And human beings are very visual creatures,
Mhm.
right? We sacrificed our, I mean, Freud has this theory, but it does sort of bear out, modern evolutionary biology does sort of bear it out that we developed a lot of our current ways of being and thinking and relating to one another in the world at the expense of our sense of smell. That as our sense of smell and our sense of touch, even our ability to discern the world through touch and smell, especially, and even our ability to hear, sort of the full range of natural ambient sounds around us, we began to privilege our visual sense instead. And so we became very much, creatures of light, at that point in our
Mhm.
evolution. And this is certainly reflected in the philosophies, which are nearly all very linear philosophies.
Mhm.
Like they will imagine, for instance, a journey from darkness to light, right? That's a very linear idea of a journey. Whereas there's nothing in nature at all that would suggest that that journey is a real thing. Because in fact, there's nothing in nature that does go from darkness to light, but that doesn't go immediately back to darkness. Plants
Well,
yearn towards the light, but then they die and they go back into the
oh
dark.
yeah, sure, sure,
The
sure.
seasons
And
follow
that's
the
the
same
the fear
pattern.
of death,
Right.
would
Yeah.
apply there, right?
Yeah.
Because we
So
do.
there's an ancient Buddhist text because in all of these great spiritual traditions, there were outliers. There were what one historian calls examples of sediment. There's a man named Daniel Lord Smale. Lord doesn't mean like Lord Henry or Lord Russell
Hmm.
or whatever. It's just his middle name, Daniel Lord Smale. His father was the first American academic to teach a course in deep history in the American Academy. And so I guess Danny Smale grew up in a household where they thought about such things. So he became a historian and got a job at Harvard. He wrote a wonderful book called On Deep History and the Brain, which I
Mm.
highly recommend. It's a really remarkable look at the history of the of Homo sapiens and the evolution of Homo sapiens and what's happening with the brain of Homo sapiens as they evolve. But at one point, toward the end of the book, he talks about a thing called sediment. He says that sediment collects in history the way that particles collect in the bend of a river so that in the flow of the river, when it reaches a bend, deposits of sediment collect. And if you dig down into that sediment, you can often find a lot of information about the river and about the climate of the area and about the history of the river, right? Where it was, 1,000 years ago, what kinds of pollen were in the environment and what kinds of animals were there, right? There's a lot of information there. So Smale says that in the same way, there are details and little trace words. Sometimes it's a single word, even that is preserved in the written record long after anyone understands what it really means, what it really
Mhm.
refers to, what it's even talking about. It gets preserved, like in scripture, for instance, or in the historical record. We even find sediment in fairy tales. Fairy tales, some of them have been passed down for 10, 12, 14, maybe as old as 17 or 18,000 years. Some of our oldest fairy tales
Hmm.
have been passed down and they've morphed over the millennia, but there are words or details within them that have been preserved in the story long after the time when anybody knows what they mean. I'll give you just one example. There's a wonderful passage in the book of Genesis. There's a lot of sediment in Genesis. I mean, a lot. So I'm just choosing one thing because there's a lot of things in Genesis that the rabbis have got no idea is there. Like one, here's I'll just throw out another random one. When it says in the opening passage of the Bible that there was in the beginning, God, God says separates the light from the darkness and all of that, and the waters. He separates the waters, right?
Mhm.
But when he talks about the deep, the Hebrew word tehom for deep, that God is basically severing from the sky, uh, it comes from the word Tiamat, which is the ancient goddess whose body is dismembered by her grandson Marduk. She's murdered. Her body is dissected and dismembered in order to create the visible world. And so what Yahweh is doing in the first verses of Genesis is he is dismembering the goddess to make the visible world. So it's
That
not like made of nothing, it's made out of the mother.
yeah,
So,
that would have
okay,
been
so this is the
Genesis,
rabbis have no idea that that's there,
right?
but because they didn't read cuneiform, they wouldn't have access to these ancient scriptures. But that's what's going on. And actually, the methodical way in which the world is created out of nothing by God mirrors exactly what Marduk does to Tiamat, the sea mother. So that's one. Another is
Mhm.
there's this great word. This one's a lot less violent and more beautiful and romantic. At one point, Abraham's son Isaac needs a wife. And so they send a servant to find him a wife in another country, somebody's not related to, I guess, right?
Mhm.
So they go and they find this woman, Rebecca. And it's a wonderful exchange about how, the servant knows. It's like recognizing a Tibetan Lama or something. Like he has tests. He's sent there and he's a very discerning person, this servant sent by Abraham to find a son find a wife for his son. And Rebecca passes all these spiritual tests. And so then she's brought back by the servant to Isaac. And Isaac senses, I guess, that, this long journey is over and is about to arrive. Somehow he knows it. And so it says, and Isaac went out into the field to meditate at the eventide to meditate at the eventide. So he went out in the evening to meditate, right, into the field. So
To
he's going out
prepare
to
for
this
his.
hour of God, right? He's going out into
Mhm.
this dusky sort of liminal state to meditate. The Hebrew word for meditate, suak, only appears once in all the scriptures here. Later on, they use a different word, which means to mull over, to think about, or whatever.
Like
That
contemplate,
word's, what's that?
more like contemplate, right? Where,
Well, it's a weird word
yeah.
because it can mean to wander, to walk, to
Oh,
complain, to wonder, to think about. It can mean to get lost. It can
mhm.
mean a lot of different things. And chances are it probably meant all of the above. Biblical scholars can't make heads or tails of it because they have nothing to compare it to.
Mhm.
But it clearly represents this. It's the closest thing we have in the it's the closest thing we have is a word canon to Turiya, that word from the Mandukya Upanishad,
Uh-huh.
right? Turiya and Suwak are basically the same word.
I
But
see.
in order to understand that, you have to realize you're looking at sediment. You're looking at a leftover state of mind that when the rabbis were writing down the Bible, they had already lost. They could no longer access this state. So what they're writing about and what they're describing is something that they no longer have access to. So 3,000 years ago, 2,800 years ago, I can't remember the exact dates when the Tanakh was being put together, but somewhere during the Babylonian exile, some Shakespeare like genius was taking all these oral scriptures and
Mm.
listening to them and writing them all down and organizing them into a coherent storyline.
Yeah.
And but that person who did that had no idea what the word meant.
Mhm.
But the word lasted. The word endured. The word was left over from a time when people did know what it was and
I
were able
see.
to access it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that in the original Old Testament, I forget what it's called, the first, I can't remember the term, but it's like there's a first and a second. But in the first one, Yahweh had a female consort, and they created the world together.
Ashura.
Uh-huh.
Are you thinking
Okay.
of Ashura?
And then in the second version, he created the world alone.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
they did away, and she had all these titles. One of her title was Our Lady of Heaven. Another one was Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And I've read that originally in early Christianity, the Holy Spirit was feminine.
Yes.
It was Sophia.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
so
the Hebrew word
patriarchy did away with all that.
Yeah.
Um,
So another piece of sediment comes from the Buddhist tradition, and it comes from a text called the Sandokai, which basically translates branching streams flow in darkness. It's a Zen text. It's actually a polemical Zen text where Zen Buddhists are Chinese Zen Buddhists are duking it out with one another over who's most enlightened. Right. So an unlikely place to find a piece of very ancient sediment, right? You've got this Zen master sort of basically setting forth his point of view in a polemical treatise against another school of Buddhism, right? A lot of infighting, basically a lot of infighting in Buddhism from the time the Buddha dies down to the present. Everybody's staking out their particular claim to pieces of that original wisdom. So anyway, in this particular text, there is a line that says, light and darkness are like the foot before and the foot behind in walking. Light and darkness are like the foot before and the foot behind in walking. It's just this one little bit of Chinese poetry. And yet it stands out in the entire treatise as the truest, oldest thing in the treatise. It goes back before Buddhism. That line is probably older than the Buddha, maybe by 1,000, 2,000, maybe 10,000 years. It probably predates I'm sure it predates the language that the Buddha spoke in, right? And the language that the sutras are written down in. It's very, very old wisdom. And what it says is that light and darkness, birth and death, light and darkness, day and night are like the foot before and the foot behind in walking. And what it tells us is that the journey that we are on as souls and as individuals is an endless journey, a long story that alternates between day and night, between various different states of consciousness, between being alive, being dead, coming back to life, being reborn, dying again, being reborn, over vast swaths of time, right? Now, the person who wrote this, I don't think had that understanding of it at all. He has a Buddhist rubric for understanding reality that he slots it into, and it's a familiar sort of idea, probably an old folk saying that he just sort of incorporates into his text. So that's a piece of sediment that points to a way of being in the world and experiencing being in the world that isn't linear. And that sees the dark foot and the light foot as being able to bear weight, on a journey, and that not being privileged or favored by the other, right?
I love that metaphor.
It's a beautiful line. It's the only line I can quote from the Sandokai because it's the only one that made really deep sense to me.
And you also quote from the Lotus Sutra where it says the dark and the light are one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I like that too. Another quote I wrote down was the good news is that according to the Lotus Sutra, at many other times and places throughout the vast darkness of the cosmos, that teaching has been lost and recovered before. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, yeah. So one of my absolute favorite things about Buddhism, and I think it was probably one of the things that attracted me to it in the beginning, because I was a Zen Buddhist monk and the editor of a Buddhist magazine and spent a lot of time with Buddhism writing about it. I still write about Buddhism.
Mhm.
But one of the things that I love the most about Buddhism is its view of big time. Buddhism loves to play with eternity, and it loves to play with paradox. Sometimes I think a lot of our modern ideas about time travel probably originate in the Buddhist sutras because the Buddhist sutras just range across the universe. It's like there are Buddhas in every world system and every galaxy, right? Some galaxies have a lot of Buddhas, right? And they've been around forever. Here's one of my favorite mind-bending Buddhist ideas, and that is about Amida Buddha. Amida Buddha is the Buddha of infinite light and life.
How
So
do
the
you spell
story
that?
is Amida, Amida. Ami, it's short
Okay.
for Amitabha,
Ah,
Buddha of infinite light. Yeah. But anyway, the Buddha of infinite light and life, Amida, uh, supposedly came about in the following way. So there was one time long ago before the creation of this universe, right? So if you do the math, the way the sutra describes, it's happening at a time before the birth of this universe, right? Before the Big Bang.
right.
So before the Big Bang, in another universe, there's this bodhisattva named Dharmakara. And Dharmakara resolves to be a Buddha, but with he isn't comfortable with privilege and unequal access. And so, we think about these problems today. Apparently, even in other universes before our universe, it was already a problem. So Dharmakara isn't happy with this arrangement. He isn't happy with the fact that it's easy for some people to get enlightened. Some people are born into families where they have disposable time and income. So they can go on long retreats, right, to Tassajara or they can go to Nepal, right? They can't, they have the freedom, time and
Mhm.
money to go off and do these practices, right? They're not constantly having to just to make enough money to eat and feed their children. So Dharmakar is very upset with this idea that people don't have equal access to enlightenment. So he resolves to become a Buddha and to establish a pure land where anyone can become enlightened just by saying his name, just by calling out Namu Amida Buddha, adoration to Amida Buddha, right? It's that simple. That's all. That's the only requirement. It's the lowest bar imaginable. As my one of my Buddhist mentors, a wonderful Japanese man, used to say. He used to say, uh, "He says, how does a dog say Namo Amida Butsu?" And I said, "I don't know." How he says, "One one." And I said, "One one, what does that mean?" He says, "Well, you say bow wow, but in Japan we say one one." Right. So one one is Amida Buddha, right? And he says, well, and I said, well, what about I don't know, a meadowlark? And he goes, that's how a meadowlark says Amida Buddha, right? So it's easy. Everybody gets in. All right. So here's the mind-bending reality of this. So Dharmakara makes 48 vows, one of which is this called the primal vow, which is this idea that he's not going to become a Buddha until anybody who says his name, until he has accomplished this task of setting up the universe, which is presumably our universe, in such a way that anyone can become enlightened or be reborn in his pure land just by calling his name. So he won't become a Buddha until he has achieved that. Okay.
Mhm.
But the end of the story is But of course, he must have achieved it because now he's a Mita Buddha. And here
Mm.
we are in this universe. And what it says is that the universe we are born into is a unitary ecological whole in which nothing can be left out, in which all things are included and have a place, in which all things are perfectly in place, and by definition, all are enlightened. It's basically an ecological vision of reality rather than
Yes.
a theological or a Buddhological vision of reality. So he is basically it's a reimagining of religion as ecology. And this was, 2,000 years ago, somebody came up with this sutra. So in the
Beautiful.
Lotus Sutra, you have two Buddhas, Shakyamuni Buddha and Many Treasures Buddha, who travel around the universe in something like the TARDIS from Doctor Who. It's called the Treasure Tower, and it's this like police box, like in the sci-fi show. And they travel throughout the universe together, giving, preaching the Lotus Sutra, right?
Mm.
So, but throughout all time and space, the Lotus Sutra is being taught. The Lotus Sutra is preached when people forget about this business about the foot before and the light, the darkness and light, right? Are like the foot before and the foot behind in walking. When people forget that and they think they're on some short, linear one life journey where the object is to get as many toys as you can before you
Mm.
die, as much money as you can before you die, where delusion prevails. And people don't realize that they live eternally and they're reborn eternally,
Mm.
but they pass through many bodies over and over again, feeding one another, eating one another, and this grand unitary planetary ecological whole. When they forget that, then Shakyamuni and Many Treasures arrive in their space, basically a spaceship, and they arrive and they preach the Lotus Sutra to remind people. And so that's what I was talking about in the book. But, like we are constantly going off a cliff as a species, or people like species like us throughout the cosmos, or according to the Lotus Sutra, are always going off a cliff and destroying or nearly destroying themselves.
Yeah.
And then the teaching comes back because the teaching is just there. It's in the sun and the moon. It's in the darkness. It's encoded in our genes, right? It's not like we have to find it someplace else. It's
Yeah.
not like we can even lose it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that indigenous story. I don't remember which which culture it came from, but where uh, God is, or the Great Spirit is trying to find some place to hide the truth, and I don't know. There's a coyote or some trickster kind of animal uh, discussing it with him, and the Great Spirit says, "I know. I'll hide it at the bottom of the ocean." And the coyote says, "No, they'll find it there." Talking about humans. And
Yeah.
and then he says, "I'll hide it in the sky." No, they'll invent spaceships and they'll find it there. And this goes on. He's looking for a place to hide the truth. And then finally he says, "I'll hide it in their own hearts." And he says, "Oh,
Wow.
yeah, they'll never find it there."
Beautiful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Hmm.
is bittersweet truth, but so true. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's the only place it can't be destroyed. It can be ignored,
Yeah.
but it can't be
Yeah.
destroyed. Yeah.
So you also write that during the night, the ancients had these in between periods of sleep. Um, it also gave them easier access to their ancestors and others in the afterlife. So would you elaborate a little bit on that? Is there much written about that you've
Well,
come
I
across?
mean, there's a lot of lore about that. Again, if you kind of have to know what you're looking at. So you
Mm-hmm.
have to kind of already know it's there. It's like the truth hidden in the heart. So you
Mm-hmm.
have to know that there are sedimentary traces in the scriptural record and in the historical record of these practices and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll just give you one example that I happen to know a bit about. and that's the Catholic Rosary. The Catholic Rosary, which most people, nowadays, a lot of people associate it with, the anti-abortion movement because the Catholic Church has politicized it so much over the past century. But the Catholic Rosary really evolved out of what was essentially a tantric practice that developed during the Middle Ages about 1,000 years ago, whereby people would reenact the Annunciation, the moment when the angel Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary and says, "Ave gratia plena Dominus tecum, hail, full of grace, the Lord is with thee."
Mhm.
And he doesn't even say the name Mary; he just says full of grace. Full of grace means basically great mother. Hail, great mother, the Lord is with thee.
Mhm.
And medieval people believed, and I'm talking all medieval people, like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux believed this. The Pope believed it. It was a universal belief in the Middle Ages that those words, "the Lord is with thee," were marked the moment of divine union. They marked the moment of the hieros gamos, the joining of the male and female divinity, right? And medieval people, you know, if you were to ask, a medieval bishop or some really educated person, most priests weren't even illiterate. They just memorized the mass. But if you were to ask some, church theologian if Mary was a goddess, they would have said, well, no. But she behaved like a goddess, and everybody believed she was a goddess. They treated her like a goddess. They prayed directly to her. In the
Mhm.
miracle stories from the Middle Ages, God and Jesus rarely appear as characters. People go to the Virgin Mary, they say this spell-like prayer, they make a prostration in front of her statue and they kiss her and they pray for a miracle and they get it. So the miracle stories are filled with her
But they
answering,
say a novena.
or they say a novena, right?
Yeah, to Mary, right?
To Mary,
Pius the
exactly.
12th raised her status by instituting the Feast of the Assumption,
Right, right,
right?
exactly.
And Carl Jung said that was a big step towards feminism.
Well, they walked that back during during the Vatican too, but yeah,
Well,
there was
no, it's still a feast day, and
no,
it's
I know
still
it's still a feast day. I mean the advances of feminism they walked back,
oh.
yes, but starting
Mm,
with Vatican II.
mhm,
But anyway, so with the rosary, there are all kinds of things that are hidden in the rosary. Our daughter Sophie sometimes describes the rosary um, as being smuggled down through the centuries in the hull of the Catholic Church, right? Like a
mm,
stowaway, she calls it. It's like a stowaway inside of the church, a church within a church, right? And it carries within it encoded a lot of very ancient wisdom, like the 15 mysteries of the Rosary, for instance. The mysteries of birth, the mysteries of death, and the mysteries of resurrection are basically an ancient Mediterranean mystery cycle that
mm,
has just found its way into the Middle Ages. And people understood that what they were looking at was a circular vision of time rather than an end time. The way we know this is that during the Middle Ages, the priests tried to conform the rosary to the storyline of the New Testament, which is linear. The
right.
storyline of the Bible is a linear story. It's a written story. Most written texts are linear in the way they unfold, rather than oral texts, which tend to be more circular. And so the New Testament begins with the birth of Jesus, and it ends with the Last Judgment, basically the end of the world.
Mm,
So the priest said that we will have these 15 mysteries: the Annunciation, the Visitation, the Nativity, so forth, so on, the
mhm,
crown of thorns, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the so forth and so on. And the 15th mystery, they said, the last of the glorious mysteries, the mysteries of resurrection, would be the last judgment.
mm.
Well, medieval people said no. They didn't make a big deal about it. They just refused to pray it. Priests all over Europe tried to conform the rosary to a linear view, and people who still had still very much in touch with their pagan roots, they were still crowning the Virgin Mary every May with roses as if she were the
Mhm.
Great Mother, right?
Mhm.
We're still praying directly to her, bypassing God and Jesus. And so they said, no, that's not how it works, because if a mother is in charge of the world, there's no last judgment. Everything just starts over. And in fact, that's how the rosary works. It
Yeah.
starts with birth, it goes through death, resurrection, and then it starts with birth again. And if you look at medieval statues of the Virgin Mary in the crowning, like the last mystery, if you look at the illustrations of the Virgin Mary and the last mystery, she's always young. She's not a 63-year-old woman.
Mhm.
She's holding a baby in heaven.
Mhm.
So the story just starts again. It's the cycle of the seasons.
I see.
That
Yeah.
cycle of the foot before and the foot behind. It's that endless circular cycle of eternity, that just gets repeated endlessly. So all of this is embedded and hidden in the rosary, as well as the word, the practice of the dead. When Bernadette Subaru was having her apparition of Our Lady of Lourdes, at one point she says to Our Lady of Lourdes, your rosary has 6 decades instead of 5 like mine.
Hmm.
What are those prayers for? And Our Lady of Lourdes is supposed to have said, those prayers are for the dead. And in fact, the rosary was one of the words, the word Rosencrantz means not only rosary, but it also means a graveyard.
Mm.
And the word rosary goes all the way back to the Feast of Rosalia, which is where the tradition originates, which is the Feast of the Dead in ancient Rome. So the rosary was originally a prayer to honor the dead and to pray to the dead. And
That's
eventually
fascinating. I
that
was
gets
raised Catholic and I never
the
knew
Catholic Church
that.
represses that and gets rid of it as much as possible during the
Yeah.
modern
Well,
age.
I also never knew that Our Lady said that to Bernadette,
As part
and
of the
that she
oral
had six
tradition,
decades.
the church has suppressed that, but
Mm.
the people of that particular thing is not in the official record that was
Mhm.
kept of what Bernadette said and what Our Lady said. But
Mhm.
that tradition lives in the area of around Lourdes. And so, and if you look at that area and the number of decades on rosaries from that area, there are always 6 decades.
Interesting.
And Our Lady
Interesting.
of Lourdes, even today, has 6 decades on her rosary. The statue has 6 decades.
Huh.
So there's an extra decade. So that this it's probably a true detail from the life of Bernadette that's simply been suppressed by the church because they could find no way to accommodate that view that the rosary was for praying for the dead. There was a specific rosary you could say for the dead, for the
Mm.
souls in purgatory.
Mm.
But in fact, the rosary originally as a practice was a way of communing with the spirits of the dead. But during the witch craze, the main thing that women were burned for or hung for, tortured for throughout Europe during the witch craze was for communing with the dead. That was the main charge against them, spirits. Yeah, that was once universal practice.
Yeah, it still is in some circles. um,
It is in my house.
yeah,
What you see behind me is our ancestor altar.
right.
It's just
Um,
sprawled. It was originally an altar, now it's a whole wall, and soon it'll be the whole downstairs because people keep dying.
yeah. Clark, tell us about the voice you heard when you were on Cape Cod about to take your usual walk in the dark, about the column of saints.
Mm.
Tell us about that.
So the apparitions of Our Lady of Woodstock began on in the early morning on June 16th, 2011, and I've been in the habit of getting up to walk in the middle of the night for my whole life, and I I had already started writing, I think, about like I already had that idea of the hour of God. I'd already just, written about that. I'd actually
Mhm.
even written some feature pieces about waking up in the middle of the night for magazines. Uh, but I had no interest in the divine feminine at all. I had one book in my library, vast spiritual library. It's 1,000 books or more. One book on the divine feminine. I didn't even realize it was about the divine feminine. And I've read it 3 times. It's called The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. It's all about the Holy Mother. And that gives you some idea of how unlikely a candidate I was for a visitation like this. But on that night, I got up to go for my usual walk, and I witnessed a vision. Uh, Before I left, a voice spoke to me and said, just stay in tonight, don't walk, be very still, which I did. I learned to do that as a Buddhist monk, make myself very still. So I did. And after about 45 minutes, I opened my eyes because I felt a presence there. And I saw a young girl, about 17, hazel, hazel eyes, auburn hair, freckles around her nose, a roundish moon-like face. And she had a X of black electrical tape over her mouth, which I removed because I just had the sense that it had no business there. And, uh, and so I removed it and she gasped, but she didn't say anything. And I didn't say anything. And eventually went back to meditating. I woke up the next morning. I could feel her presence, even though I couldn't see her. And I continued to feel her presence continuously for another 2 weeks. At which point, again, I went downstairs to go for my usual walk. Again, the same male voice said, "Don't go out, remain inside." Be
Male voice.
male voice. Yeah. Said, if you read the literature on I mean, I had no way of knowing this because I'd never read about apparitions. I had no idea how these things unfolded. I later discovered that there's often, especially in the beginning, there's an announcement. Maybe it prepares you that something is about to happen, but there's often a buffer. Something will happen beforehand to let you know to be
Yeah.
prepared for something special is about to happen. But in any case, I so that time I yeah, my every thought for 2 weeks had been obsessive thought was, who is she? And I had no idea who I was looking at or what had happened. And again, same thing. I made myself quiet, and I felt her there. I opened my eyes and I saw her. And this time I asked her, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am the hour of God." And I said, stupidly, stupidest thing I think I could have said. I said, "I think I know what that is." And she said, "If you knew, you would have said who, not what." And that was it. That was that was for me the beginning of the whole journey because the way I described it in the book was it was like a door got flung open in the back of my brain and went off its hinges, and I could never get it closed again. It's the best way I can describe it. Um, so then, I had begun to have some suspicion of what was going on. Again, I never read any of the literature on apparitions. She didn't appear in a form that was identifiably the Virgin Mary. But then a few weeks later, after that, uh, on the night of August 22nd, which was the feast of the coronation, although I didn't know that at the time, I didn't know anything about Catholic lore or Marian tradition or any of that. And we were vacationing on Cape Cod, and I woke up in the middle of the night because she was speaking. And she said, "If you rise to say the rosary tonight, a column of saints will support your prayer." And so I realized she was there in the room and I was hearing her voice. And I said, but I don't have a rosary. And she said, you do. And I remembered that I had bought a rosary that very day,
Oh my
flea
goodness.
market on
That's
impulse.
funny. That's
That
really
I
funny.
had bought a broken rosary, actually, one that was missing some beads. I had been at a flea market right before we left to drive to Cape Cod on a vacation. I had seen this broken rosary that or not broken, it had been repaired, but it was still missing some beads. But it had this image of Our Lady on the centerpiece,
Hmm.
and it had been rubbed by somebody for a long time. It was very old, and I bickered with the person selling it. She finally said, "I take it for $8." So I bought it, and
What
I put it
made
in
you
my
buy
pocket.
it? What
What
what made you buy it?
I don't. It's weird. I wrote about it extensively in The Way of the Rose, and Perdita and I took turns writing the chapters in The Way of the Rose,
Mm, I haven't read
co-authored
that
the
yet.
book.
Hmm.
Waking Up to the Dark is the first book in a trilogy. Waking Up to
Hmm.
the Dark, which I wrote. Second book is by both me and Perdita, called The Way of the Rose: The Radical Path of the Divine Feminine Hidden in the Rosary. The third book is Take Back the Magic: Conversations with the Unseen World, and that's all about Perdita's work with the dead. But they're all three about the apparitions of Our Lady of Woodstock, and the three books are a trilogy, a complete trilogy that describe the unfolding, uh, story of the apparitions over a period of years.
Hmm.
But yeah, so
So you found your rosary and
yeah,
you,
so I had bought, I had taught myself the rosary, like when I stopped being a Buddhist monk, I experimented with everything. I was
uh
incredibly promiscuous spiritually. I mean, I was completely loyal to Buddhism.
spiritually promiscuous.
14, yeah, spiritually. But for 14 years, I was completely devoted to Zen Buddhism. And but when I stopped, I I I just I was insatiable. I studied every form of Buddhism I could imagine, and when I exhausted that, I studied everything from Vedanta to ancient Hasidic prayer practices to Muslim prayer practices, bead practices. You name it. I was insatiable. Uh,
Hmm.
Stop myself. But one of the things I learned was the rosary, so I knew how to pray it.
I see.
I had prayed it once for a month and found that I was able to get in a state of relaxation
Mm,
that was as deep as anything I experienced when I was a Buddhist monk living under controlled conditions in a
mm,
dim, remote mountain monastery with no artificial lighting, for months at a time. That I was able to do that just by saying the Catholic beads. So
mm-hmm.
I assumed it was a placebo effect, and I had tricked myself into it.
Oh,
And
that's funny.
I stopped. I just gave it up. So, but I knew how to pray it. So I took the rosary. I got up and I went and I said the rosary, and I've said it every day since.
Mm,
That was it. That was the beginning. The next morning, I woke up though. And I thought, oh, so there's only one figure in the world that I know of who invites you to pray the rosary and then makes promises based on whether you follow through or not. And I thought, oh boy, I was afraid I was going to have to become Catholic. I was terrified. Like, I definitely did not want to become Catholic, not in any lifetime. And
but go back a little bit because you said the rosary and the column of saints appeared.
no,
No.
that in fact, I had no idea what it meant, and it
Uh,
had a vaguely Christian ring to it. Like the communion of saints, perhaps.
yeah,
But I hadn't
yeah,
heard of it. And I wasn't raised with saints because I was raised Protestant by Protestant parents.
I see.
Had no Catholic background, so I really had no idea what it meant. I told Perdita what it was. She felt like she had instantly had some understanding of it because we're working.
Was she raised Catholic, Perdita?
She comes from a long line of Irish Catholics.
Oh,
Was
okay.
raised by
Okay.
atheist bohemians, but she had a
Oh,
deeply devout Catholic grandmother. She went to Catholic school. she converted to Catholicism briefly when
Uh-huh.
in college, like, for a month or two. And then, just you can read her book. She writes about it and Take Back the Magic. So I'll let her tell that
Okay.
story on her own. But
Okay.
circumstances contrived to squirt her out the other side of the Catholic Church very quickly. And but she she came by it honestly. But she had been working with the dead already, and her ancestors for quite some time before that. So she had an intuitive grasp of what it was. Later, Our Lady explained it to us. If you look at the first of the chapters that are entirely spoken by Our Lady in part 5 of The Way of the Rose, the book The Way of the Rose, she elaborates on the column of saints and what it is. But she says, I speak to you with one voice, but the voices below me are many. And
Mm,
those are the voices of the dead. So she says, I speak to you with one voice, but the voices below me are many. And it's
mm,
not just the dead, the human dead, but the dead of the planet, the animals, the dirt, the stone, the soil, the physical matter of the planet. Everything that exists now exists because of something that came before and was
mm,
originally something else.
yeah.
Everything on our planet was originally came from stars. So
Mm,
everything that we are is the dead,
right.
and everything speaks to us, constantly speaking to us. But if we try to listen to all those voices at once, it becomes confusing. So Our Lady speaks one
When did,
voice.
Clark, when did you make the connection to the Black Madonna? Or
Well, that
how?
happened. That happened very early on. The morning after the Column of Saints. And in retrospect, Our Lady choreographed everything very precisely. Later, in fact, she would tell us that all of this was although she would improvise, on the fly in certain occasions, most of the main things that would happen were determined a long time ago. So everything was choreographed. Like, for instance, the next morning, I woke up and I thought, oh my God, I've got to be Catholic. And I didn't even tell Perdita. I don't want to go near that. She was already freaked out that when I first started praying the rosary in the beginning, years before, she thought, oh my God, I married my Catholic grandmother, So I didn't even want to tell her about it, but we went to a used bookstore in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, wonderful bookstore called Heritage Books. And, it's classic Cape Cod used bookstore, piles of books stacked up everywhere, all stuffed on the shelves. But then, just like benches or stools around the chair where other stacks of books are. And there, right as we walked in, there on the top of a stack of 6 or 7 books that people had obviously leafed through but decided not to buy was a blue paperback called Queen of the Cosmos: Interviews with the Visionaries of Medjugorje, right?
Ah,
The apparitionists, the teenagers who witnessed the apparitions of the Virgin Mary at Medjugorje in I
mhm,
guess in Bosnia. And so I picked it up
mhm.
and I thought, oh, so maybe this has something in it that will make sense of what's happening to me. Like, I had vaguely heard of Medjugorje. Like, I guess I read a newspaper article at one point, but I had no real knowledge of it. I opened up the book, and it was an interview with Jan Connell and the apparitionists. And there's like a chapter devoted to each one. And I opened up to, I think it's Maria and Marcia. And Connell asks her, is the rosary a universal recommendation of Our Lady of Medjugorje? Uh, since it is so distinctly Catholic, is she really asking everybody to pray it? And Marcia said, Yes, Our Lady asks that everyone on earth pray the rosary, regardless of their religion or their belief.
Hmm.
And so it goes on from there to say, yeah, you don't need to be Catholic to pray the rosary. So that was the first thing that happened. What happened immediately after that was that I went with my daughter, who loves jewelry and clothes, a few doors down, and there was a little store called trying to remember, the something Cowgirl. And it was a women's clothing and jewelry store. And we walked in, and there were all kinds of beautiful rosaries, handmade rosaries. But they were like goddess type rosaries, or they were obviously, it had a feminist slant. They had like, it was from a line called Saints and Angels. And they had like medallions of like Joan of Arc on them instead of crosses and things like that. Very beautiful. And so I started talking with the proprietress, and she said, I said, you have rosaries here? She said, oh yeah, anybody can pray the rosary. You have to be Catholic. So she says this to me.
Interesting.
And so we start talking, and eventually we become friends. So a couple of weeks later, I'm talking to her on the phone. We're back in Woodstock. So this is maybe early September. And she says, yeah, I said, how did your journey start? Like, where did this start for you? She said, oh, well, my life was at loose ends, and I decided to, clean my life up, get my act in order. And I decided to go off and, uh, and look at all the Black Madonnas in Europe. And I said, the Black Madonnas? What are those? And she said, oh, well, there are these Black Madonnas that have, darker complexion, that are in many cases much older than the other images of the Virgin Mary. In fact, some of them may actually be statues of the goddess Isis that were repurposed as Christian statues. Some of them may actually be statues, like Our Lady of Rokemandor may actually be a statue of Isis. And so she said, there's a book called The Cult of the Black Virgin by Ian Begg. That's the best book. So I ordered a used copy that night, and it arrived in the mail the next day.
Wow.
From Amazon, which was bizarre. And I opened it up, and it had been underlined and annotated by somebody whose handwriting was exactly like my mother's. And I called my mother and I said, did you ever own this book? Is this your book? And she said, no, I've never heard of it. And so I looked through it, and I looked through all the highlighted places. This previous owner, whoever it was, had like highlighted all the parts I needed to read. And by the time I'd read the book for about an hour, I thought, oh, the Black Madonna and the Lady of the Hour of God. That the Black Madonna, my understanding of the Black Madonna is not just that she is that the darkness is the color of her skin, but the hour in which she comes.
Oh,
She
I
is the
see.
hour of God, that she comes in the dark. She's not just dark skinned, but she represents that
Mhm.
that portal. She is like the dark skinned lover, beloved in the Song of Songs. For lo, I am black and I am beautiful, right? She's dark skinned.
Right.
And the Black Madonnas of Europe were very closely connected with the beloved from the Song of Songs. The people during the Middle Ages, like Bernard of Clairvaux, drew a direct connection between the Black Madonnas that they prayed to and the Shulamite from the Song of Songs. There was a
I see.
direct in there.
So how can the ancient figure of the Black Madonna, what is the message that she has for us today in terms of what's happening in the world? Is it just pray the rosary, or does she have something more specific in this gospel? I mean, I read I read your book and I read the few pages of the gospel. But
Yeah.
how would you summarize that a little bit? Because we have to open to questions.
You
And
mean summarize the gospel according to the dark?
yeah,
Well, the Waking Up to the Dark is really the world's longest introduction to the world's shortest book, because the whole book is really, there's a lot of sleep science and memoir and
right.
paleoanthropology, and there's a lot of writing about climate change and religious history and so forth and so on in the book. But really, it's just intended to set up the last 3 pages of the book, which are spoken directly by Our Lady, and they are her Gospel according to the Dark. And those 3 pages, she has said, are the sum of what of her message, the sum of what she wants to tell us. The messages that she has given since then, in the beginning, every few days, and then eventually settling into a rhythm of on the 16th of every month, uh, are all just an elaboration of what she said in the Gospel according to the Dark. But that is the main message, and it's her longest utterance. It's about 800 words long, but eight paragraphs, I think, and it's very hard to summarize it. But if I had to, I'd say, she says, I alone am, but I am not alone, for you are with me. Your heartbeat is my heartbeat, and your breathing is mine, right? So she speaks about the fact that, she has always held us in her embrace. Every atom of our bodies is held by her, is being held by her. That we can you know basically choose not to listen to her voice and not to accept her presence and not to know that she's there to guide us, but nevertheless it's true. She does say early on in the Gospel according to the Darkness, she makes a few predictions. One is, not one written word will remain. Not one written word will remain. And so she, I at the end of Waking Up to the Dark, I spoke about her as Our Lady of Climate Change. I said, if forced to give her one name, even though she's older, I came to realize ultimately that although she appeared to me in a form or in a context that I could make some sense of, which is the Virgin Mary, in fact, she has been appearing for throughout all of our evolutionary history. And so she's incomparably old. Maybe she's like Amida Buddha before this universe, even.
Well, the divine feminine,
Yeah,
right? You could say she's the divine feminine, which has been around since the birth of humanity.
yeah, yeah,
right?
surely. So, but I said at the end of the book, if I had to give one name to her,
Mm-hmm.
this particular incarnation, it would be Our Lady of Climate Change, because she's come at a moment in human history where the world is about to change in dramatic and for human beings probably irreversible ways. Human beings may or may not adapt, but there won't be any going back to the world that was before climate change. Climate change will literally change everything. Climate is the great regulator. It's the great reality,
Yeah.
atop which all other realities, atop which all history dances atop climate, or below climate, or within climate. Climate is everything. Human beings have lived in denial of this fact for since the dawn of the agricultural age, but it remains true, and there really isn't any way to game it. So I said at the end of Waking Up to the Dark that I mean, I'm not a techno narcissist. I do not believe that there are technological solutions to climate change,
Right.
and I think if you read the Gospel according to the Dark, you'll see that Our Lady makes it pretty clear that those efforts will come to nothing. That there is a path through this. She holds out her hand to take her hand and to let us guide her through the changes that are coming. but we will not be in charge.
Right. Which is a good thing.
Yeah. So,
Because we've been under the impression, under the illusion that we are in charge for way too long.
yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we're getting a massive correction to that.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
it'll take a while before the truth of it sets in. But eventually, I don't think there will be any argument because there won't be any doubt.
Right.
There will be holdouts for a long time, believing that we can game this, that we can somehow bend the world to our will. But
Mhm.
uh, eventually, that anthropocentric dream will come to an end, and we will wake to a different world, her world.
Yeah.
She speaks a lot about that in her messages. You can go to wayoftherose.org and you can read the Gospel According to the Dark, and you can read all of her other ladies' public messages that she's delivered from the beginning there. And other messages are contained in, waking up to the dark. There are a few things she said that are only there. And a great many messages are included in The Way of the Rose. And as I said, the last 10 chapters, the last 10 smaller chapters in the part 5 of the book are all only her words. Each chapter is entirely spoken by her. Yeah.
So, what is it that you get out of saying the rosary? Yeah.
There are many devotions and many ways of doing this.
Mhm.
Obviously, I can't do all of them. And for me, the rosary was once I started praying it and started looking into it, became an endless source of fascination. And all of the lore associated with it, medieval miracle stories about Our Lady and the rosary. And I spent a lot of time learning about it, researching it. What became clear to me very early on was that Our Lady lives, she is the Lady of the Rose Garden. She lives in the rosary, and that it is a time tested, easy access uh, method for coming into her presence, and that it's designed for that purpose. Right? It is, really a rose garden. It's like an enclosed garden. It has that little pathway at the beginning, those little beads that hang down on the pendant. You
Which are
pray
the
those
Our Father and the glory be to the Father and
three Hail Mary, Our Father, three Hail Marys, and the glory be, and then another Our Father, and then you're in the main loop, right? With those
and then
50
it's
Hail
all Hail
Marys,
Marys.
five, five
Yeah.
Our Fathers, and 50 Hail Marys, right? Divided into groups of 10 called decades. Each of those is associated with a mystery. And so you're contemplating, or maybe you're just announcing these mysteries, like the Annunciation, the Visitation, the Nativity, the finding of the temple, so forth and so on. But what's really happening is that you are saying a mantric prayer interspersed with a prayer, the Our Father prayer. So you're saying these male and female prayers, and you're reenacting the hieros gamos, or the union of a male and female divinity. And so you're doing what the rosary was originally meant to do with this little mantra that people said, Ave gratia plena Dominus tecum, that you're reenacting that moment of divine union that is the marriage of these two principles, that is what creates life. If you want to think of it on a cosmic level, then what you get is basically our planet, which includes everything necessary for life, but one thing, which is sunlight. Sunlight is necessary for life. Without sunlight, there is no life. Everything is there in Earth. Everything that is necessary to produce the myriad life forms and the complete functional unitary ecosystem that makes life possible, that makes everything we know possible, that makes everything happen. It's all here, but it isn't activated until that ray of sunlight comes in and touches something. And so that the sun in that scenario is the Our Father. And
Mm-hmm.
those 10 Hail Marys, so they're 10 to 1. So you know whose prayer it is. It's Our
Mm-hmm.
Lady's prayer, 10 to 1 ratio. So it's about her. But but the wave-like structure is it what it does is it basically, I mean, if I had to explain it biochemically, is it triggers a prolactin reaction. You actually oftentimes, once you get used to praying the rosary, you'll often find yourself falling asleep
Mm-hmm.
during the decade, during the Hail Marys. You'll nod off. Someone asked me one time, is there anything wrong with me when I pray the rosary? I fall asleep. And I say, well, if you're not falling asleep when you pray the rosary, you're probably not doing it right. Right. So you'll start to doze off. Your consciousness will kind of go dark,
It's
right?
like a mantra. It's a
Like
mantra.
it is a mantra. Yeah,
Yeah.
the Our Father is not a mantra. For one thing, it's very long in relative
Mm-hmm.
comparison, but also it's not repeated. But the
Mm-hmm.
repeated effect of the Hail Mary, and then so what you get this wave-like movement. It's like a whale going down deep in the ocean, and then surfacing to take a breath, and then diving deep again. So there's this wave-like motion. The effect of that on consciousness is to basically bring us into the presence of Our Lady, to make her presence palpable and felt. A
Well,
lot of things happen.
how about bringing us into the presence of our true nature, our own true nature?
Well, I don't. Yeah, I like that term. I mean, it's certainly true nature is certainly a term
Our
that
essential self, our essential
yeah,
spiritual.
it's a term that I'm very familiar with from my years of Buddhism.
Mhm. Well, I don't mean it
And those
just
terms
as a
nowadays.
term.
No,
I
I
mean it
know.
as a reality of
Right.
who we are,
Yeah.
which is
Our
also who she is, of
yeah.
course.
Well, Our Lady of Woodstock, who I've also called Our Lady of Climate Change, she rarely ever uses that language. What she will say is she will talk about our heart's desire and the long story of our souls. And so she will speak about the kind of an unfolding of a kind of a journey through time, through deep time, from our beginningless past to our endless future, following the thread of our heart's desire. So she'll speak of that a great deal.
Mhm.
She rarely will say anything like in terms of like a true self or she'll speak of the soul, but she never really speaks of the soul as a thing that is separate from her, really. The
Right,
soul is something that is journeying, is always journeying, and it's never still. It's never. It may have a self, but if you point at it, it's like a one of those particles in quantum physics. You point at it, and it's already gone. It's moving. It's constantly moving. Yeah, that would
right.
be
The wave collapses to a particle.
so,
Mhm.
so I encourage people to read her messages because her way of speaking is it is unique, and if you read enough of her messages, you begin to develop a felt sense of what she is saying. Um,
Beautiful. Yeah.
yeah, I can will sometimes try to articulate what I think she meant, but she really speaks for herself. I just I
Mhm.
just report to Perdita what she says, and Perdita writes it down. But I don't presume to understand everything she says.
Okay. Maddie has a question. Maddie, unmute.
Okay. As I understand the rosary, the actual original creation of a rosary is that it's made from rose beads. And I was given a recipe for making rose beads, and it's it's a very long process of
They're
deep
hard to make. Yeah, that's what I hear.
yeah, deep cooking of the rose petals until so it's an it's like an alchemical process where the rose petals turned to black finally
Yeah.
because of the slow roasting.
Yeah.
And then the fragrance actually changes. The smell of the roses change to a subtle, muskier, uh,
Yeah.
cooked
Yeah.
smell.
Yeah.
And um, and so I wondered if you had any thoughts about that or had anything to share about, or
Well,
whether.
I tried once to do it and failed utterly. There are nuns who have perfected this and passed down the knowledge of how to do this, over the centuries. And I'm not sure when the practice first started. It may go all the way back to the Middle Ages, but they've certainly perfected it. And you can purchase rosaries like this that are made oftentimes in convents. And they're very beautiful. I've owned some before that I bought, and the smell is really, really remarkable. Even if you just handle them, your hands will smell like those roses for some times. I'll sometimes take my beads and have some rose oil. They're wooden beads, and I'll put the rose oil on them. It's nice, but it goes all the way back to probably to Paleolithic times. Roses have been associated with the divine feminine since before history. We say that the rose is Mary's flower, but before Mary's, it was the flower of Isis. Before Isis, it was the flower of Inanna and Venus, and it just goes back and back until we run out of scripture because people weren't writing anything down, and so clearly the tradition probably goes back even further than that. People were weaving crowns of five-petaled roses for one another before there were statues of Our Lady. Originally, the statues of the Divine Feminine could fit in the palm of a hand, right? There were these little Paleolithic figurines, right? They weren't meant for display on any altar. They didn't have a footing that they wouldn't even stand upright. They were meant to rest in the palm of a hand. And they're ubiquitous throughout the Upper Paleolithic. People find statues that are uh, thousands and thousands of years old. I think the oldest is I think Our Lady of Full Fells is maybe, I want to say, 28,000 or older, maybe. So these old figurines, they wouldn't have made a crown for something that small. More likely, what they did was at when the roses came into bloom, they crowned one another, right, as in tribute to the mother, right. Then once they began to settle down in permanent dwellings and to build villages and finally cities, they started to dedicate spaces to her, temples, ancient temples to the goddess. And these had life-size statues, and those statues invariably were crowned on a yearly basis with roses. So the tradition goes back a very, very long way. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Uh, I was questioning more if you had any insight to the alchemicalness of.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't know what the recipe is. I would be really curious if you find out. Let me know. I did ask someone who is going to one of these convents, where they make them. One of our Way of the Rose members. I asked her one time, "Why don't you see if you can get some tips from the nuns?" She came back. You know what she said? The nuns weren't telling.
I have a recipe for them.
Do you? Oh,
Yes, I
okay.
make rose beads.
Oh,
So
good.
yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah.
So what do you mean by what is the alchemical? Um, what did I didn't understand your question exactly, Maddie.
Well, the process is you gather the petals, that it's a long process of gathering the petals, and
Mhm.
then you heat them without adding any water. and they cook. They make their own juices first and they cook, and it takes hours because if the fire gets too hot, they'll burn.
Right, right. I understand, but I don't understand exactly what your question was.
I guess, Gloria, it's an experience,
Ah,
the experience of the transformation of the living rose into the dark,
Hmm.
where,
Yeah.
as Clark said, it permeates your hands, it permeates your nose,
mhm,
the
Right.
cooking permeates the house, and
mhm.
of course, the
It
apparition.
sounds to me like you probably have more insight into this than I do, but because you've got hands-on experience with this process. But I will say that if you don't already know about this, you may find it very interesting. Have you ever heard of a thing called the Rosarium Philosophorum?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes,
well
yes.
then you know that the Rosary of the Philosophers was a way of describing visually through pictures the process of the alchemical process, right? It was
Mhm.
like 20 woodblock paintings that took you through the process. What most people don't know is that if you look at the pictures of the Rosary from the Middle Ages, a lot of them correspond exactly to the pictures in the Rosarium Philosophorum. And
Mm,
so there was quite a dialogue going on between alchemy and the rosary during the Middle Ages, right?
mhm.
They were
Oh, that's
using the same
interesting. Hmm.
artists were using the same images to describe both processes. So yeah, so I think that's yeah, it sounds like a wonderful thing. Makes me want to try again.
Anybody else have a question? Jen, you do. Okay.
Okay, it's the first time I've used this, so I just wanted to ask if you're familiar with the white buffalo calf woman that the Lakota had uh, had received. That she appeared to them, and that of course they honor her. Do you think that she's a counterpart of the presentation of the Madonna, the Black Madonna?
Well, that's really interesting. I don't know. I mean, I obviously do know about that tradition. I don't know a great deal about it. I know that we have in our Way of the Rose Fellowship on Facebook and at our meetings, we have I think 30,000 plus members on Facebook, and we have if you go to wayoftheRose.org, our website, you'll see that there are anywhere from 6 to 10 Zoom meetings or face-to-face meetings, various places every day. And I have talked at meetings with people who either because they are Native American and have direct experience of it, or because they resonate with that story, uh, have talked about it. And they will sometimes. I've been at meetings where people have invoke the image of the white buffalo woman in talking about the mysteries. Because what
Oh,
happens at a meeting is, we will ask for like a Zoom meeting. We'll ask for volunteers to 5 volunteers, each one to announce the mystery. Like I don't know, the Annunciation, right? Where the angel comes to Mary, and then reflect on it briefly. And people will share what they thinking about it or whatever. And I've heard people talk at meetings about this. So, you could probably go to a few meetings and you probably run across somebody who's given this a lot of thought.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So my answer would be yes. It sounds like there's a connection,
mm-hmm.
but you never. I know that there are a lot of Native American people who, because of uh, the Catholic missionaries, came in and
Mhm,
converted either by persuasion or by force. People who have combined syncretically the Virgin Mary, and some people don't like some people in Native American communities don't like the idea that why can't Mary be a manifestation of white buffalo woman, right? Why is white buffalo moment? You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
people go back and forth, and other people are very comfortable with it. Like we
Mhm.
have at our men's meeting, we have a men's meeting every Tuesday, and one of our members lives in New Mexico and grew up on the res, and routinely brings Native American spirituality into of his in his family tradition into the rosary, and he is so completely syncretic, like he doesn't privilege one tradition over the other. He just moves seamlessly, like when he talks about the mysteries between Native American spirituality and the rosary. So it's kind of a beautiful thing to watch. Somebody
Mhm.
who's really integrated it that much. Like it
Mhm.
doesn't feel like those traditions are at war inside of him. He just sort of like they're sort of a single thing. Because I think he has very Catholic, pious Catholic members of his family, and I think he has other members of his family who are more, traditionalist in in a Native American spiritual tradition, more firmly grounded in that alone.
Very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, it's time to close. So I just want to thank Clark for joining us this evening and thank
Well, thank
all
you
of
so
you who
much. It's been
attended.
wonderful. It's been wonderful to talk with you, and
Likewise.
I have known Kara for
Mhm.
many years,
Yeah,
Mhm.
my
shortly
daughter.
after we moved to Woodstock. So
Yeah.
great to connect in this way.
Yes, I'd like to continue that connection.
Yeah.
And I want
Thank you
to
so
learn
much.
more about The Way of the Rose. I want to read that book and maybe have you and Perdita
Oh, that would be wonderful. And
talk about it.
Visit the shrine to Our Lady of Woodstock sometimes.
Where is that?
It's right next to our driveway on
Oh,
Plough Lane in Woodstock, New York. We get visitors from all over the world.
okay.
And it's open, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And people
Great.
come, they pray, typically people will come and pray for something. And if they're traveling from, out of state or out of the country, and
Mhm.
then when they get an answer to their prayer, they will come back and say thank you. And we have a traditional miracle book like they had during the Middle
Mm.
Ages, which is a register which sits at the shrine inside of the shrine box.
Mm.
And people will come back and they'll write their stories.
Wow.
So
I look forward to seeing that.
wonderful.
Yes. Thank you. Uh, are
Looks like
you,
Sherry has the last question.
Sherry? Did you want to say something? You're muted, I think. Oh,
Right.
no.
I just wanted to follow through with what was brought up a little bit about white buffalo calf. And if you're familiar with the book Buddha in a Red Face,
Yes, I've heard of this book.
Eduardo Duran, and I've heard him speak quite a bit, and it's quite fascinating when he learned from his own tradition that he had gone the Western way of psychotherapy, and it wasn't working with the native population, and he
Ah,
completely switched how he was approaching things, and suddenly the people started the clients started opening up to him because he didn't put it in the phrase of oh, you have this difficulty, you have this problem. There's just the spirit of depression or the spirit of is moving through.
ah,
And as soon as they framed it that way, then it opened everything up. And they
it's
realized, oh,
amazing how that can happen. It's beautiful.
yes. So I just wanted to toss that out. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And so much, and
That's
I
really,
appreciate so much. I've learned a lot, and I'm going to start looking at the Way of the Rose, and I'm very interested in the climate change goddess. We need this right now.
yes, we do. Yes, we do. Thanks
So,
so much, Sherry, for attending, and all of you who attended. And Clark, I will see you again soon.
very good. Thank you so much, Gloria. And thank you, everybody who came
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
by.
Bye.